The French alliance forced the British to completely rethink their strategic priorities in dealing with their rebellious colonies. Sir William Howe was replaced in command of the British armies in North America. He actually resigned in protest because of all the stinging criticism he had received for the surrender of Burgoyne when he should have been meeting Burgoyne in New York, and demanded an investigation in England to justify his conduct. But in any case, Howe was very soon off the scene, and Sir Henry Clinton was promoted in his place as commander of the British Army in North America. Clinton would withdraw the British Army from Philadelphia, and the bulk of it would be sent to the West Indies to carry the war to the French islands in the Caribbean. Only a reduced force would be maintained in New York City, and Clinton was to use New York City and those remaining troops as the base for mounting raids along the American coast, just to keep the pressure up. But as far as a major theater of warfare, the British had now been forced to turn their attention to dealing with the French in other places in the world. The British marched out of Philadelphia on June 18, 1778, headed for New York City with 3,000 loyalists, packing their bags and leaving Philadelphia behind them. George Washington struck his winter camp in Valley Forge, and looking for an opportunity to cut off part of the slow-moving British column, he looked for an opportunity and pounced on it on June 28th near Monmouth, New Jersey, when he attacked the British rear guard under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis. The officer to whom he delegated the attack botched the job, and in short order, Clinton had turned around with his main column to rescue Cornwallis, and suddenly it was the Americans who looked like being cut off. But then Washington arrived on the scene to take personal command of the situation, and with surprising ease, the Americans organized themselves, developed their lines, fended off Clinton's assaults. And under cover of night, the British turned around and continued their march to New York City. But one New Jersey captain enjoyed the spectacle immensely. He boasted that the Continental Army had met and fought the flower of the British Army and succeeded in humiliating the proud King's Guards and haughty British grenadiers. And indeed they had at Monmouth. And one reason for it was the influx of French money that allowed Washington to re-equip and retrain the Continental Army during the dreary months of winter encampment at Valley Forge. The army Washington commanded through 1776 and 1777 had been chronically underclothed, underfed, and amateurishly officered. At one point, the shortage of muskets in the Continental Army was so acute that Washington paraded the Connecticut State Militia and confiscated all the usable muskets they possessed for the Continentals. The army that dragged itself into Valley Forge in December of 1777 faced a winter in which up to one-fourth of the army was sick, and almost another fourth was without shoes or without adequate clothing to face the winter. Washington, in fact, had only 7,600 men ready for duty in February of 1778, and a third of them were on detached service at outposts scattered between Trenton, New Jersey, and Wilmington, Delaware. The French alliance, though, once it was formalized in February of 1778, rapidly altered the appearance of Washington's army. The French shipped 23,000 muskets to the Continentals, and French money bought the services of a cadre of veteran French and European mercenary officers. The young, the very youthful Marquis de Lafayette, Baron Johann de Kalb, the Polish hero Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and the most puzzling of them all, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Although von Steuben liked to pass himself off as a Prussian general, member of the staff of Frederick the Great, the truth was that he had never risen higher in the Prussian army than the rank of captain. What Steuben did have, however, was nearly 20 years' experience as a junior officer in training soldiers. And that made him more valuable to the Americans than any dozen or so aristocrats in lace epaulets. Thanks to Steuben, by the spring of 1778, the Continental Army had acquired precision, discipline, and, most important, self-confidence. The Prussians' claim to nobility might have been fraudulent, but not his claim to competence. Sir Henry Clinton did not propose to try serious consequences with Washington's Continentals if he could help it. The British Empire had its hands full elsewhere with the French, and so, as I said earlier, America began to take a back seat in this war. In September of 1778, the French launched a series of attacks on the British islands in the West Indies, capturing the islands of Dominica, which they had lost at the end of the French and Indian War, St. Vincent, and Grenada. The American sea captain, John Paul Jones, took a French squadron raiding along the English coast. And in September of 1779, Jones challenged and captured a British frigate, HMS Serapis, in exactly the kind of stand-up fighting at sea that the Royal Navy had never expected to lose. In April of 1779, Spain joined the alliance, hoping, in the event of a British defeat, to recover control of Gibraltar. So Britain was now stretched fatally thin, and America fell from being the chief object of British attention to being somewhere in the middle. This did not keep Sir Henry Clinton from doing his best to at least keep the Americans off balance. In December of 1778, peeling off about 3,000 men from his small garrison in New York City, Clinton sent a raiding expedition against Savannah, Georgia. The surprised Americans, defending Savannah, offered a brief resistance and then ran, leaving Savannah and a good portion of the Georgia hinterland open to British occupation. It had taken, in fact, so little effort to capture Savannah that the British promptly turned and lunged northward at Charleston in the summer of 1779, even briefly laid siege to Charleston. The following summer, Clinton himself personally took charge of the British troops in Georgia, marched northwards again, and this time forced the surrender of Charleston on May 12, 1780, with 2,500 Continental soldiers falling into his hands as prisoners. Carolina loyalists now came flocking to Clinton's banner. And one group of loyalists, in particular, were organized as the British Legion under the command of a colorful young British cavalry officer, Banastre Tarleton. And Tarleton's Legion quickly acquired a particular reputation for evening up scores with their fellow Americans. Under Tarleton's orders, for instance, Loyalists massacred a detachment of 350 Continentals at the Waxhaws at the end of May. If this kept up, Sir Henry Clinton would be able to roll up the rebel colonies one by one, this time doing it from the south rather than trying to do it from the north. Clinton organized other raids along the New England coast in the summer of 1778, one of them hitting New Bedford, another New Haven, Fairfield, and Norwalk, another New London. Unlike Howe, or unlike Gage, Clinton felt no inclination to go easy on the Americans. Deprived of reinforcements, shoved to the back of the strategic shelf, Clinton and his officers took out their frustrations on their opponents and their property. The raids on New Bedford and New Haven included widespread burning, looting, destruction. And not only there, handsome bribes and promises allowed British agents to recruit the Iroquois Confederation in New York to rampage through the unprotected New York and Pennsylvania frontiers. The Cherokees were also promised, bribed, and encouraged to harass the backwoods of Georgia and the Carolinas. And tribes like the Shawnee, the Miami, the Wyandot were intended to attack Virginia's most extended settlements across the Appalachians in Kentucky. Promises of freedom were also offered to slaves who would run away to the British lines. And in some cases, the newly freed slaves, like the so-called Colonel Tighe and his Black Brigade, took the king's shilling and served the British Army as scouts, engineers, and raiders in New York and New Jersey. Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, even briefly recruited an Ethiopian regiment of runaway slaves to turn and then fight their former masters. The success of the British in the South, the success of the British in causing havoc on the frontier and on the coastlines, as you can imagine, set beside the comparative inactivity of Washington around New York City, had the usual malcontents applauding and the usual tongues wagging. Over Washington's disapproval, Congress split off 1,400 Continentals from Washington's command and sent them south in June of 1780, where Horatio Gates, the victor of the Battle of Saratoga, was appointed as overall American commander. Gates quickly proved how well-placed Washington's disapproval had been. The main British force in the Carolinas had been turned over by Sir Henry Clinton to Lord Cornwallis, while Clinton returned to directing operations in New York City. And on August 16th, Cornwallis handily defeated Gates at the Battle of Camden, South Carolina. Gates, in fact, was so badly beaten that Gates himself mounted a horse and rode, without stopping, 60 miles to Charlotte, North Carolina, riding in the process right out of any hope of further military glory. "This country is entirely conquered," crowed one British officer. "The people crowd in from all quarters to deliver up their arms." Well, that was, of course, an illusion. In real terms, Cornwallis had too few men to hold the American territory that he now controlled, much less to think of conquering more. And he was reminded of this in October when a loyalist force of 1,200 men under Major Patrick Ferguson was attacked at Kings Mountain in western North Carolina by American militia who surrounded the loyalists, overran their position, and remembering what Tarleton and the British Legion had done to the Waxhaws, hanged 9 of the loyalist leaders as traitors. The loss of Ferguson and his loyalist legion forced Cornwallis to pull back and winter in South Carolina, where lack of supplies and raids by American guerrillas like Francis Marion, the so-called Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, they together made winter quarters as miserable for the British as the British had made winter quarters miserable for the Americans at Valley Forge. Sir Henry Clinton had his own troubles in New York City, and little to spare for the aid of Cornwallis. In an effort to break Washington's grip around New York City, Clinton attempted to seize the strategic American forts above the city at Stony Point and Paulus Hook. And he did capture them, only to have Washington just as easily recapture them. Clinton then tried again by bribing a senior American general, Benedict Arnold, to betray the Continental's outpost on the Hudson River at West Point. Benedict Arnold had served with a good deal of bravery in the disastrous Quebec expedition in 1775, and he probably deserved more credit for the Saratoga victory than did Horatio Gates. But Arnold, despite that distinguished record, was in debt. He had married a loyalist wife, and above all, he was embittered by what he saw as Congress's unwillingness to reward his military genius with the sort of command he thought he deserved. And so he joined hands with Clinton to betray West Point, a plot that nearly worked until Clinton's adjutant general, Major John Andre, was captured by the Continental Army as Andre tried to slip through the American lines in civilian clothes with papers for Arnold. Andre was hanged, but Arnold escaped to New York City, where he completed his turn of coat by commanding a British raid on the Chesapeake at the end of 1780. Cornwallis's misery in South Carolina might have been easier to bear if he had realized that the Continental Army was also in some unhappy straits. It was becoming something close to a habit for the Continental Congress to lose interest in the Army whenever it went into winter quarters. And Washington's men had to endure 2 more freezing, hungry winters in 1779 and 1780. And of course, there were sporadic mutinies over pay, because pay, more often than not, was simply not forthcoming from Congress. 1,700 Pennsylvania Continentals actually set off for Philadelphia to confront the Congress directly. And an amused Sir Henry Clinton in New York City actually sent 2 emissaries through the lines in civilian clothes, this was all done in secret, to offer these rebellious Continentals full pardons and pay if they would desert to the British. But the Pennsylvanians wanted redress of grievances, not commission of treason. They hanged Clinton's emissaries, and on the strength of promises from George Washington, they went back to camp. The same happy result, the same happy ending, could not be applied to Lord Cornwallis. In January of 1781, Cornwallis had only 1,300 men ready for duty, and not more than 3,000 British soldiers all told under his immediate command. There was another 5,000 British soldiers in Charleston and Savannah, but they were needed to guard those positions, especially now that the French Navy was hovering off the American coasts and could sweep down the moment one of those garrisons was weakened. It was that French Navy which now impelled Cornwallis to his most difficult decision. Unable to draw supplies overland from Charleston or from Savannah due to Francis Marion and the American guerrillas, Cornwallis planned to set up a new base at Wilmington, North Carolina, right on the Cape, where the Cape Fear River empties out into the Atlantic. There, Cornwallis believed that he would be in perfect position to receive supplies and reinforcements by sea. There, he could reopen communications with Sir Henry Clinton in New York, and there he could set about new plans for redeeming the Carolinas for Great Britain. And all of that might have worked if Cornwallis was still facing someone like Horatio Gates. But Cornwallis was not facing Horatio Gates anymore. Gates was officially relieved of command at the end of 1780 and replaced by one of Washington's favorite officers, Nathaniel Greene, a Rhode Islander who in fact was the youngest general in Washington's army. Greene, like so many of the rest of Washington's officers, had had no training whatsoever in military affairs before the Revolution. His family, in fact, were Quakers and therefore pacifists. But Greene was a quick and a nimble learner. He had what turned out to be a natural aptitude for military command. Greene dangled one part of his army of Continentals and militia north of Cornwallis's march route, the route Cornwallis would normally have taken toward Wilmington. Greene dangles them to the north of Cornwallis's route to decoy Cornwallis away from the coastline. Cornwallis takes the bait and detaches Tarleton and 1,100 men to crush what Cornwallis assumed was an isolated and unsuspecting body of American militia. Instead, what Tarleton found at Hannah's Cowpens on January 17th were 700 Continentals and militia under the famous and wily rifleman Daniel Morgan. Morgan lured the reckless and overconfident Tarleton onward with what seemed to be a helpless, confused screen of untrained militia as skirmishers. And Tarleton looked at them and decided this was yet another opportunity to ride right down and over more Americans. But once Tarleton was committed to the attack, the militia then stepped aside to reveal Morgan's Continentals, who proceeded to shred Tarleton's ranks as they advanced to the bayonet charge. And then the militia closed the trap by curling around Tarleton's flanks, and Tarleton's loyalists and regulars collapsed. Only 140 mounted troopers, including Tarleton himself, managed to escape. Cornwallis could ill afford a disaster like that at Cowpens. But at the same time, he could afford still less to sit where he was. Greene closed off Cornwallis' plan to head for the coast and forced the British to keep swinging inland and exhaust themselves in a lengthy in-country march through North Carolina. Desperate to shake off Greene, Cornwallis uncoiled and struck the Continentals at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th. The British scored a technical victory. They captured 4 American cannon. But in the process, Cornwallis had sustained twice as many casualties as Nathanael Greene. And unlike the Americans, Cornwallis had little hope of replacing them. Cornwallis finally circled down to Wilmington on the coast in April, but he found once he got there that he could not stay there. The French Navy prevented the landing of the supplies that he was relying upon, and Cornwallis's best hope was then to strike northward again, this time into Virginia, where he could link hands with British forces at the Chesapeake under Major General William Phillips. Cornwallis forced his way into Virginia, joined Phillips' troops, and then turned to establish a supply base at Yorktown on the James River Peninsula. But instead of this being Cornwallis's great opportunity to be resupplied and renew his campaign, this turned out to be Washington's great opportunity to make sure that Cornwallis would have no further campaigns. In June of 1781, the French army, which had been promised to America, arrived in Rhode Island and moved over to New York City to join Washington. Taking advantage of French warships to blockade the Chesapeake Bay, Washington left a small force to keep an eye on Sir Henry Clinton in New York and marched the remainder of this combined French-American army, probably about 16,000 men, overland to Virginia. There, Washington trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. And after 3 weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. There were still British troops in Charleston and Savannah and New York City, but after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, there were none to spare for offensive operations anywhere in North America. Nor was Lord North's government in London in any position to offer Sir Henry Clinton any more troops to replace those lost at Yorktown. By 1782, in fact, the war was costing Britain £20 million a year to wage. The loss of trade with America caused exports in Britain to fall by 18%, woolen exports in particular, plummeted from a figure worth approximately £900,000 sterling in 1772 to only £58,000 sterling in 1776. That was the toll the war was taking on the British economy. Bankruptcies in British finance increased by approximately 200% between 1772 and 1778. On February 27th, 1782, surveying the wreckage of its plans and hopes in North America, Parliament voted to suspend the war by a slim margin of 234 to 215. And a month later, reading the handwriting on the wall, Lord North resigned as Prime Minister. An interim government under the Marquis of Rockingham lasted only until Rockingham's death in June, when he was followed by William Petty, the second Earl of Shelburne. In turn, Lord Shelburne opened communications with Benjamin Franklin in Paris. And by November, a provisional agreement recognizing American independence had been okayed, and it was followed by a formal peace treaty in Paris on September 3rd, 1783. If the war did a lot of damage to the British economy, and it did little good to the American economy either. During this war, American shipping, which had been, at the same time as it was being regulated, also protected by the British Navy, now became the target of its former protectors, both the Navy and British privateers. And along with that, American merchants lost the privileges they had enjoyed as British subjects while trading in Europe. At home, the simple wastage of war in South Carolina alone ran up a bill estimated at £3 million sterling. Slaves and indentured servants deserted to the British in droves. 5,000 Georgia slaves sought refuge in Savannah after it was captured by the British. 20,000 South Carolina slaves sought British protection in Charleston. Even Thomas Jefferson lost 30 slaves to a British raiding party in Virginia. And then there was the collapsing American currency. By 1782, Congress and the states together had issued $440 million in paper money, all of which was scarcely worth more than newsprint. Between 1777 and 1780, prices in some regions in America went up between 1,900% and 5,000%. How's that for inflation? Overall, per capita income in America fell by 46% between 1774 and 1790. That's the equivalent of the Great Depression. American politics was almost as deranged by the war as the American economy. Thousands of loyalists were imprisoned by the Continental Congress or forced to flee after retreating British armies. And the disappearance of the loyalists wiped out a significant segment of the old colonial elite. In their places, the new state constitutions adopted by state after state undertook dramatic experiments in popular government. Philadelphia's Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, complained that the new Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which handed out the vote to nearly all adult males, regardless of property holding, well, Rush complained that this Constitution was called a democracy when a mobocracy, in my opinion, would be more proper. All our laws breathe the spirit of town meetings and porter shops. And this was coming from a friend of the Revolution. One French officer was shocked to find that among his allies, a locksmith, a cobbler, or a merchant may become a member of Congress. And far from this embarrassing the Americans, they were proud of it. Another French officer could scarcely contain his laughter when he heard Continental officers naively ask French generals, aristocrats all, what their trade was at home. Well, restraining this spirit of leveling was risky, and never more risky than when Congress tried to do the restraining. The Articles of Confederation, which were gutted by Congress of all but the gentlest of controls on the states, took 2 years to move through Congress, and then an additional 3 years to be ratified by the states. And the Articles of Confederation did not actually come into effect as the first American Constitution until March of 1781, only 7 months before Washington accepted Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown. You see, it was almost easier to defeat the British Empire than to get Americans to agree on politics. But defeat the British they did. And the Treaty of Paris legally recognized the independent existence of the United States of America and ceded to it not only Britain's claims on the 13 colonies, but to all the western lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, the lands won, in fact, from the French only 20 years before. Now, mind you, Benjamin Franklin, as part of the negotiating team for the treaty, had tried to suggest to Lord Shelburne that the British add Canada to the cession as a goodwill gesture, but that went nowhere. Certainly, though, the most unlikely result of the war, and I mean this from a European view, concerned George Washington. The ineptitude of Congress and the political chaos in the States set a number of Washington's officers to whispering that the Continental Army should take matters in hand and make Washington the first king of America. They would bring order to things, and so would Washington as king. Washington would not even listen for a moment. The army was demobilized peacefully, and Washington resigned his commission in December of 1783, desiring only to return to Mount Vernon and the life of a gentleman planter. All this was done without the slightest effort to grab the power the army would gladly have put within his reach. Instead, Washington simply rode away back into private life, not only setting an example of virtuous Whig republicanism, but probably saving the neck of the Confederation in the process. If this is true, cried a thunderstruck King George III, then he is the greatest man of the age. The question now became whether Washington's fellow Americans were going to be able to live up to his example.